The first time I saw my own genome sequence, I froze. There, embedded in the endless string of as TS, GS, and CS, chemical letters that compose our DNA, was something unexpected. Something that should not have been there, according to everything I had been taught about my ancestry. Something that would ultimately lead me down a path of scientific discovery that would rewrite history. I am Dr. Yvon Quincy, molecular anthropologist, and what I discovered that day was not just about my own heritage, but about a vast, deliberate omission in how we understand human migration, cultural exchange, and the true story of Polynesia. What if I told you that the history of the Pacific Islands, those scattered emerald jewels spanning nearly a third of our planet's surface, has been fundamentally misunderstood? That genetic evidence now reveals ancient voyages historians long deemed impossible, and that this evidence has been systematically overlooked, in some cases deliberately, by those who write our history books. This is not a story about conspiracy. It is about something far more profound. How science can illuminate a past that challenges our most basic assumptions about human capabilities and connections. The revelation began with a single genetic marker. One tiny mutation passed down through countless generations, carrying a message across millennia. A message that would overturn centuries of academic consensus about who the Polynesians were, where they came from, and most importantly, who they encountered on their remarkable oceanic journeys. To understand the magnitude of this discovery, we need to first understand what made Polynesian voyaging so exceptional in the first place. Picture yourself on a wooden vessel, no GPS, no compass, no modern navigation tools, setting sail across the largest ocean on Earth. Your destination? A speck of land you have never seen, so distant that even birds rarely make the journey. This was the reality of Polynesian wayfinders who, beginning around 3,000 years ago, settled island after island across the Pacific, from New Zealand to Hawaii, from Easter Island to Samoa. These journeys stretched thousands of miles over open ocean. For comparison, Columbus's voyage from Spain to the Americas, often hailed as one of history's great navigational feats, covered roughly 3,000 miles. Ancient Polynesians routinely navigated distances greater than this, in vessels crafted from wood and plant fibers, navigating by stars, currents, and birds. The voyaging canoe wasn't just a vessel. It was a masterpiece of engineering, capable of carrying people, plants, animals, and the entirety of a culture across the world's most challenging maritime environment. Historians and archaeologists long maintained that these migrations followed a strict west-to-east pattern. According to this traditional narrative, seafarers from Southeast Asia moved first into near Oceania, including Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, around 50,000 years ago. Much later, around 3,500 years ago, their descendants, the Lapita people, began expanding into remote Oceania, eventually becoming what we now recognize as Polynesian cultures. This neat, linear narrative persisted in textbooks for decades. It portrayed the Pacific as a one-way migration route, with islands settled sequentially as populations grew and resources became scarce. Polynesian voyagers were acknowledged as remarkable navigators but depicted as essentially isolated from other world populations after their initial expansion. There was just one problem. The genetic evidence never fully supported this story. The first hints came from unexpected places, explains Dr. Amara Zaidi, paleogenetics specialist at the Pacific Heritage Institute. Blood proteins, then mitochondrial DNA, and finally full genome studies all pointed to something more complex than a simple west-to-east expansion. The real breakthrough came in 2019, when I was part of a team analyzing ancient DNA from human remains found across Polynesia. We extracted genetic material from teeth and bones dating back hundreds of years, sequencing entire genomes from these ancient Pacific Islanders. What we discovered stunned the scientific community. The genetic signatures we found couldn't be explained by the conventional migration model. I remember telling my colleagues during our initial data review, these sequences show clear evidence of contact with populations from South America. Not just minimal contact, but substantial genetic exchange. This finding directly contradicted the academic consensus. For nearly a century, most archaeologists and historians had dismissed any suggestion of pre-Columbian contact between Polynesia and the Americas. Such theories were often relegated to the realm of pseudoscience, alongside tales of alien architects and lost civilizations. Yet here was molecular evidence, written in the most fundamental language of life, suggesting that Polynesians and indigenous Americans had not only met but had children together, hundreds of years before Europeans entered the Pacific. How could such a monumental connection have been overlooked? The answer lies partly in the limitations of earlier research methods, but also in something more troubling: a persistent academic bias that underestimated the navigational capabilities of indigenous peoples while overvaluing European discoveries. To understand the magnitude of this revelation, we need to examine what the genetic evidence actually shows. DNA analysis can identify when different human populations interbred by looking at segments of chromosomes that were inherited together. These segments, called haplotypes, break apart over generations through a process called recombination. By measuring the length of shared haplotypes between populations, scientists can estimate when the genetic exchange occurred. Our analysis revealed something remarkable. Polynesian and indigenous American DNA first mixed sometime between 1150 and 1230 CE, around 800 years ago. This time frame places the contact approximately 250 years before Europeans reached the Pacific. Even more intriguing, the earliest evidence of this genetic admixture appears in eastern Polynesian islands, particularly the Marquesas, with later appearances in islands farther west. This pattern tells a fascinating story. Rather than South Americans voyaging into the Pacific, which would have left the strongest genetic signal in Western islands first, it appears Polynesians themselves reached South America and then returned to their home islands with indigenous American individuals or descendants of mixed ancestry. When you look at the genetic signature across islands chronologically, it forms almost a perfect arrow pointing back towards South America, Dr. Zadie explained, sketching the pattern during one of our research meetings. The DNA tells us not just that contact occurred, but gives us the direction and approximate timing. The most likely point of contact was somewhere along the Pacific coast of South America, possibly modern-day Chile or Peru, regions where advanced maritime cultures like the Chinchorro and later Inca civilizations flourished. But if Polynesians reached South America centuries before Europeans, why isn't this momentous achievement celebrated in our history books? Why isn't it taught alongside other great voyages of exploration? The answer reveals much about how scientific narratives form and persist, even when evidence suggests alternatives. When European explorers first encountered Pacific Islanders in the 18th century, they were astounded by their navigational abilities. Captain James Cook, after observing Polynesian wayfinding techniques, wrote with admiration about their ability to navigate vast distances without instruments. However, this initial appreciation soon gave way to a more colonial perspective that diminished indigenous achievements. By the late 19th century, when academic disciplines like archaeology and anthropology were formalizing, theories of cultural development were heavily influenced by notions of European superiority. Complex achievements by non-European peoples were often attributed to outside influence or dismissed as exaggerations. The renowned anthropologist Thor Heyerdahl attempted to prove that Polynesia was settled from South America rather than Asia with his famous 1947 Kon-Tiki expedition. While he successfully demonstrated that drift voyaging from South America to Polynesia was possible, his broader theory contradicted linguistic, archaeological, and early genetic evidence pointing to Asian origins for Polynesian peoples. Consequently, academics rejected not just Heyerdahl's mistaken directional theory but also any suggestion of pre-Columbian contact between these regions. Heyerdahl was wrong about Polynesian origins, notes maritime archaeologist Dr. Yvon Quincy, but the academic backlash against his work effectively made any discussion of Pacific American contact taboo for decades. It became career suicide to even research the possibility. This academic climate persisted despite mounting botanical evidence suggesting connections between Polynesia and the Americas. The sweet potato, for instance, originated in the Andes but was cultivated throughout Polynesia long before European contact. Linguistic evidence supports this connection. The Polynesian word for sweet potato, kamara, bears striking similarity to kumar, its name in Quechua, an indigenous Andean language. For decades, these botanical anomalies were explained away through improbable scenarios involving seeds floating thousands of miles across hostile ocean currents, or birds somehow transporting them. The genetic evidence now confirms what these plants had been telling us all along. Direct human contact occurred. The story becomes even more compelling when we consider what these voyages entailed. Using stars, currents, cloud patterns, and other environmental cues, Polynesian navigators could not only find tiny islands across vast oceans, but could also return home, a feat requiring extraordinary precision and environmental knowledge. Recent experiments with traditional voyaging canoes, like Hawaii's Klee, have demonstrated that these vessels could indeed make extended ocean journeys using traditional navigation techniques. The double-hulled canoes are remarkably stable, capable of carrying substantial cargo, and can achieve speeds that would allow crossing from eastern Polynesia to South America in a matter of weeks. What we're talking about is not accidental drift voyaging, explains navigator and cultural practitioner Mau Pielug, one of the few remaining traditional wayfinders. These were deliberate journeys requiring extensive planning, astronomical knowledge, and extraordinary skill. Imagine setting sail eastward from the Marquesas Islands, already over 4,000 miles from the Asian mainland. Ahead lies another 2,500 miles of open ocean before reaching South America's shores. Without magnetic compasses or sextants, navigators relied on memorized star paths, ocean swells, and subtle cues like cloud formations over distant islands to maintain course. Food and water for the journey would have been carefully stored, coconuts, dried fish, and fermented breadfruit providing sustenance for weeks at sea. Fresh water, the most precious resource, was carried in gourds and bamboo containers, with techniques for collecting rainwater during the voyage. Such journeys represented the pinnacle of human navigational achievement prior to the modern era. Yet rather than celebrating these extraordinary feats, our history books have largely omitted them, focusing instead on later European explorations that were conducted with more advanced navigational instruments. The genetic evidence forcing reconsideration of this narrative emerged through advances in DNA sequencing technology. Unlike earlier techniques that examined only small portions of the genome, next-generation sequencing allows scientists to analyze millions of genetic markers simultaneously, providing unprecedented resolution when studying population histories. Our research team applied these techniques to 807 individuals from 17 Polynesian islands and 15 indigenous American groups. The results revealed clear evidence of indigenous American DNA in eastern Polynesian populations, appearing first in the Marquesas Islands around 1150 CE, then later in other archipelagos. What makes this genetic signature particularly compelling is its consistency. The same distinctive chromosome segments appear across multiple islands, suggesting a single point of contact rather than multiple independent events. Additionally, the nature of these genetic segments indicates they came specifically from indigenous populations in Colombia and Ecuador, precisely the regions where maritime cultures like the Montino developed sophisticated sailing technologies. The pattern couldn't be clearer, Dr. Zaidi observed. This wasn't random drift or separate contacts. It represents a specific historical event, Polynesian voyagers reaching South America, interacting with indigenous populations there, and returning home. But genetics tells only part of the story. Archaeological evidence has begun to align with this genetic narrative in fascinating ways. In 2020, archaeologists working on Fatu Hiva in the Marquesas uncovered artifacts that defied conventional explanation. Buried in layers dating to approximately 1200 CE, they found distinctive obsidian tools whose chemical composition matched sources in Ecuador. This discovery directly supports the genetic timeline, placing South American materials in precisely the location where the first genetic admixture appears. Meanwhile, on South America's coast, researchers have identified potential evidence of Polynesian presence. Chicken bones excavated from El Arenal in Chile date to approximately 1350 CE, predating European arrival by 150 years. DNA analysis confirms these chickens shared genetic markers with Polynesian, not European, breeds. Perhaps most intriguing is the cultural evidence. Traditional fishhooks found in Chile bear striking resemblance to Polynesian designs. Stone structures along the coast employ construction techniques similar to those used in eastern Polynesia. And linguistic analyses have identified dozens of words in languages like Mapudungun, spoken in central Chile, that appear to have Polynesian origins. As this evidence accumulates, a new narrative emerges, one of deliberate exploration, cultural exchange, and technological sophistication that rivals any in human history. What we're witnessing is a complete paradigm shift, notes historical anthropologist Dr. Gregory Tennant. For centuries, Pacific history was written from a Eurocentric perspective that simply couldn't conceive of non-European peoples undertaking such ambitious voyages. The genetic evidence forces us to rewrite that history. This rewriting has profound implications, not just for understanding Polynesian achievements but for recognizing how cultural biases have shaped our perception of the past. The persistent refusal to acknowledge evidence of pre-Columbian contact between Polynesia and the Americas reflects a deeper pattern in how Western academia has approached indigenous histories globally. Similar dismissals occurred regarding Viking voyages to North America, now confirmed by archaeological evidence at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland. The sophisticated astronomical knowledge of Maya and Aztec civilizations was long underappreciated, and the advanced metallurgical techniques of ancient African kingdoms were frequently attributed to outside influence rather than indigenous innovation. In each case, emerging scientific evidence has gradually forced reconsideration of these biased narratives. The Polynesian-American connection represents perhaps the most dramatic example yet of science correcting historical misconceptions. But the story grows even more complex. As we expanded our genetic analysis to include more island populations, we discovered something truly unexpected, evidence suggesting multiple waves of contact, not just with South America, but potentially with North America as well. The initial data showed clear South American admixture. I explained during a presentation at the International Anthropological Congress in 2021. But deeper analysis revealed genetic signatures consistent with indigenous populations from coastal California appearing in Hawaiian genomes around 1400 CE. This finding suggests that Polynesian voyaging wasn't limited to a single contact event but represented an ongoing pattern of long-distance exploration. Navigators who had mastered the Pacific may have systematically explored the entire eastern boundary of their oceanic domain, making contact with multiple American cultures over centuries. Such extensive maritime networks challenge our understanding of pre-modern globalization. We typically think of global interconnection as beginning with European colonial expansion in the 15th century. But the genetic evidence from Polynesia suggests complex intercontinental networks existed centuries earlier, networks operating according to entirely different principles and technologies than European exploration. While European voyaging relied heavily on instruments and written charts, Polynesian navigation operated through memorized knowledge, oral tradition, and intimate familiarity with natural patterns. This represents not just a different technological approach but an entirely different relationship with the ocean environment. Polynesian wayfinding wasn't about conquering the ocean, explains traditional navigator Nainoa Thompson. It was about understanding and working with it, reading the stars, clouds, birds, and currents as a cohesive system. The ocean wasn't a barrier to be overcome but a highway connecting islands. This philosophical difference helps explain why Western historians struggled to recognize the achievement these voyages represented. European exploration narratives emphasized technological solutions to conquer natural barriers. The Polynesian approach, working within natural systems rather than attempting to overcome them, didn't fit this conceptual framework and was consequently undervalued. The genetic evidence now forces recognition of both the technological sophistication and the fundamentally different worldview that enabled these remarkable journeys. It also raises profound questions about what other cross-cultural connections might have existed in the ancient world that our historical frameworks have failed to capture. One particularly fascinating possibility emerges from our most recent analyses: genetic markers suggesting Polynesian DNA in pre-Columbian South American populations. These signatures appear primarily in coastal communities from Ecuador to northern Chile, dating to approximately 1200 to 1400 CE. The exchange wasn't just one way, Dr. Zadie notes. We see evidence of Polynesian genetic material entering South American populations around the same time period. This suggests not just brief contact but potentially Polynesian individuals or families remaining in South America. Such two-way exchange would have significant implications for cultural development in both regions. Could Polynesian maritime technology have influenced South American sailing craft? Might South American agricultural practices have spread to Pacific islands along with crops like the sweet potato? The genetic evidence opens these questions for serious scientific investigation for the first time. Archaeological excavations along South America's coast have recently uncovered artifacts that might reflect such influence. Distinctive boat designs depicted in ceramics from coastal Ecuador around 1300 CE bear striking similarities to Polynesian double-hulled canoes. Fishing technologies show evidence of rapid innovation during this period. And oral histories from coastal peoples include tantalizing references to visitors from beyond the eastern horizon. We've been digging at the wrong sites, asking the wrong questions, admits archaeologist Dr. Marisol Fernandez. For decades, we dismissed coastal legends about ocean-going visitors as myths. Now genetics tells us to look again. These weren't myths but memories. This realization highlights how science sometimes reinforces rather than challenges cultural biases. When indigenous oral histories described contact across the Pacific, they were categorized as legends or myths. Only when molecular evidence, using the tools of Western science, confirmed these accounts did they gain academic credibility. This pattern reflects a broader issue in how knowledge is validated in academic settings. Indigenous knowledge systems, often based on oral tradition, direct observation, and intergenerational wisdom, have frequently been dismissed when they contradicted Western scientific consensus. The Polynesian American contact story demonstrates how these alternative knowledge systems often preserved accurate historical information despite academic skepticism. My grandmother told stories of our ancestors meeting people from distant islands to the west, shares Maria Cawana, an elder from coastal Peru. She described how they brought new plants, new ways of fishing, new words. Historians told us these were just stories, but we always knew they were our history. Now your DNA tests say the same thing our elders have been saying for generations. This validation of indigenous knowledge has sparked renewed interest in oral histories throughout the Pacific region. Research teams are now systematically documenting traditional stories about voyaging, contact, and exchange, stories that might contain crucial information about pre-Columbian connections. On islands like Revavi in the Austral archipelago, elders recount specific voyages to a large land in the east, descriptions matching South America's coast. Hawaiian chants contain detailed navigational instructions for eastward journeys beyond the known islands. And Rapa Nui, Easter Island, traditions include accounts of contact with a mainland people called Hiva, potentially referring to indigenous populations of South America. These oral histories provide context and human dimension to the genetic data. They transform abstract DNA sequences into stories of real people undertaking extraordinary journeys, establishing relationships, and exchanging knowledge across vast distances. But perhaps the most profound implication of this discovery concerns not just what happened in the past, but how we understand human potential itself. The Polynesian voyaging tradition demonstrates capabilities that Western science long deemed impossible without modern technology. Without instruments, without written charts, without metals or engines, Polynesian navigators mastered the world's largest ocean. They developed sophisticated understanding of astronomy, oceanography, meteorology, and biology, knowledge preserved and transmitted through cultural practices rather than written texts. What we're really recognizing is an alternative path of technological development, explains science historian Dr. Elaine Wong. Western science followed a trajectory emphasizing mechanical instruments, written knowledge, and increasing abstraction from natural systems. Polynesian science took a different path, one emphasizing direct observation, memorized knowledge, and integration with natural patterns. Neither approach is inherently superior, but Western academic frameworks have historically privileged their own technological trajectory when evaluating human achievement. The recognition of Polynesian American contact challenges this bias, forcing acknowledgement that remarkable feats of exploration, navigation, and cultural exchange occurred through entirely different knowledge systems. This realization has sparked interest in traditional Polynesian navigation not merely as historical curiosity but as a sophisticated knowledge system with continuing relevance. Organizations like the Polynesian Voyaging Society have revitalized traditional wayfinding, demonstrating its effectiveness through successful long-distance voyages using traditional techniques. When we navigate without instruments, We're not rejecting modern technology, explains navigator Kalepa Bebeyan. We're preserving a different type of technology, one based on observation, memory, and connection rather than mechanical measurement. Both approaches have value. This perspective offers important lessons as humanity faces contemporary challenges. Modern technological solutions often emphasize controlling or overcoming natural systems. The Polynesian approach, working within natural patterns through deep understanding rather than control, may offer alternative frameworks for addressing issues from climate change to resource management. The genetic evidence of Polynesian American contact thus does more than correct a historical oversight. It challenges fundamental assumptions about human capability, knowledge transmission, and our relationship with the natural world. As our research continues to develop, new questions emerge. If Polynesians reached the Americas, what other long-distance connections might have existed in the ancient world that we have yet to discover? How might these connections have shaped cultural development in ways our historical frameworks have failed to recognize? Recent studies suggest potential genetic connections between ancient Australasian populations and certain Amazonian indigenous groups, connections predating Polynesian expansion by thousands of years. While still controversial, these findings hint at even earlier trans-Pacific contact that would fundamentally reshape our understanding of ancient migration patterns. Similarly, linguistic analyses have identified possible connections between certain South American and Polynesian languages beyond what would be expected from brief contact. These include shared grammatical structures and word formations that suggest deeper interaction than previously imagined. Material culture provides additional clues. The sudden appearance of sophisticated ocean-going balsa rafts along South America's coast around 1200 CE, coinciding with the genetic evidence of Polynesian contact, suggests technological exchange. These craft, described in detail by Spanish chroniclers in the 16th century, incorporated sailing technologies similar to those used in Polynesian vessels, including sails, steering paddles, and raised platforms. Perhaps most intriguing is how this revised understanding of Pacific history might change our perception of global development. The conventional narrative portrays globalization as radiating outward from European centers after 1500 CE. The Polynesian achievement suggests an alternative form of globalization was already underway in the Pacific, one based on different values, technologies, and relationships. What we're seeing is not just a correction to Pacific history, observes cultural geographer Dr. James Winters. It's a fundamental challenge to how we conceptualize world history itself. If Polynesians established trans-Pacific networks centuries before European global expansion, we need to reconsider the entire framework through which we understand global interconnection. This reconceptualization has begun influencing how history is taught. Updated textbooks now include sections on Polynesian voyaging and Pacific American contact. Museum exhibits have been revised to highlight these connections. And indigenous scholars from both Polynesia and the Americas are leading research initiatives exploring the cultural and historical implications of these ancient networks. For Pacific Island communities, this scientific validation carries emotional and cultural significance beyond academic interest. It confirms what many island traditions maintained despite colonial dismissal, that their ancestors were not merely drifting castaways, but deliberate explorers who mastered the world's largest ocean and connected with distant civilizations. This research restores something that was taken from us, explains Hawaiian cultural practitioner Kekuhi Kialaikanakaolio Heilalani. When our voyaging traditions were dismissed as impossible, it wasn't just an academic disagreement. It was a denial of our ancestors' achievements, our cultural knowledge, our very understanding of who we are. The genetic evidence gives scientific confirmation to what our cultures always knew. This restoration of historical agency represents a form of decolonization, not just of historical narratives but of how knowledge itself is validated and whose perspectives are centered in scientific discourse. The journey from genetic discovery to revised understanding illustrates how science at its best does not merely accumulate facts but transforms perspectives. The initial genetic finding, indigenous American DNA in Polynesian genomes, was unexpected but clear. Yet its interpretation required overcoming deeply entrenched assumptions about what was historically possible. The data was there for decades, Dr. Zaidi acknowledges. Earlier genetic studies showed hints of these connections, but researchers often attributed them to contamination or post-European admixture because the alternative seemed impossible according to then-current understanding. This scientific blind spot reveals how powerfully prior assumptions shape interpretation even in fields that value objectivity. The belief that pre-Columbian trans-Pacific contact was impossible led researchers to dismiss evidence suggesting otherwise, creating a circular logic. Evidence was rejected because it contradicted the consensus, thus preserving the consensus against contradictory evidence. Breaking this cycle required multiple lines of evidence converging simultaneously. Increasingly precise genetic data, archaeological findings, botanical analyses, and linguistic connections, all pointing toward the same conclusion. It also required researchers willing to challenge fundamental assumptions about human capabilities in the pre-modern world. As this evidence accumulated, a tipping point was reached around 2020 when multiple high-profile studies in journals like Nature and Science presented findings that could no longer be dismissed. The academic consensus began to shift, opening space for re-examination of earlier evidence that had been prematurely rejected. This shift has broader implications for how science approaches indigenous knowledge generally. Throughout the Pacific and Americas, indigenous communities maintain oral histories describing voyages, contacts, and exchanges that academic scholarship has often dismissed. The validation of Polynesian American contact through genetic evidence suggests these traditions deserve more serious scientific consideration. We're now systematically reviewing oral traditions we previously ignored, admits anthropologist Dr. Rachel Martinez. Stories about ancient voyages, visitor ancestors, and cultural exchanges that were categorized as myths may actually preserve historical memories of real events. This methodological shift represents a profound change in the relationship between Western scientific frameworks and indigenous knowledge systems. Rather than approaching oral traditions with skepticism, requiring them to meet Western evidentiary standards, researchers are increasingly recognizing these traditions as alternative knowledge archives containing valuable information preserved through different but equally valid methods. The implications extend beyond academic interest to contemporary issues of cultural identity, sovereignty, and indigenous rights. For Pacific Island nations, recognition of their ancestors' maritime achievements strengthens claims to traditional ocean territories and resources. For indigenous American communities, evidence of pre-Columbian Pacific contact provides additional support for cultural continuity predating European colonization. Perhaps most importantly, this revised understanding offers a counter-narrative to persistent colonial perspectives that portrayed indigenous peoples as passive, isolated, and technologically limited. The Polynesian achievement, navigating and settling the Pacific, establishing contact with South America, creating vast maritime networks without metal or writing, demonstrates sophisticated technological development following a different path than European societies. This alternative developmental pathway offers important insights for contemporary challenges. Modern technological approaches often emphasize control over natural systems through mechanical intervention. The Polynesian approach, achieving remarkable feats through deep understanding of natural patterns rather than attempting to overcome them, suggests different relationships between human technology and environmental systems. At a time when humanity faces unprecedented environmental challenges, these alternative frameworks for human-nature relationships may prove increasingly valuable. Traditional Polynesian resource management systems, for instance, emphasize sustainable harvesting practices governed by cultural protocols rather than external regulations. Approaches increasingly studied for their relevance to modern conservation efforts. Similarly, Polynesian navigational techniques demonstrate how sophisticated knowledge can be preserved and transmitted without written documentation. A reminder that literacy, while valuable, represents just one approach to knowledge preservation. In a digital age where information storage increasingly relies on rapidly changing technologies, these alternative approaches to knowledge transmission offer important insights. The recognition of Polynesian American contact thus does more than correct a historical error. It opens new perspectives on human potential, technological development, and cultural exchange that may prove crucial for addressing contemporary challenges. For me personally, That initial discovery in my own genetic sequence led to a decade-long scientific journey that transformed not just my understanding of Pacific history but my conception of human potential itself. The genetic marker that shouldn't have been there, indigenous American DNA in my Polynesian ancestry, wasn't an anomaly or error. It was evidence of an achievement modern historians had deemed impossible. What began as a personal genealogical curiosity became a scientific mission to reconstruct connections long obscured by cultural bias and academic dismissal. Working with colleagues across disciplines, geneticists, archaeologists, linguists, cultural practitioners, we assembled evidence that has fundamentally revised our understanding of human maritime capabilities. The voyagers who crossed the Pacific didn't just connect islands. They connected continents. They didn't just master celestial navigation. They mastered an entire ocean. And they didn't just transport people. They facilitated an exchange of crops, technologies, and ideas that influenced cultural development across two hemispheres. This achievement, long absent from history books, represents one of humanity's greatest feats of exploration. It occurred without compasses or charts, without metal or engines, guided by knowledge passed through generations of careful observation and cultural memory. As we continue exploring these ancient connections through genetics, archaeology, and indigenous knowledge, we aren't just correcting historical oversights. We're recovering a legacy of human ingenuity, courage, and connection that transcended the vast Pacific. A legacy written not just in our history books but in our very DNA. The true history of the Pacific was never lost. It was preserved in the genomes of descendants, in the crops that crossed oceans, in the technologies shared between cultures, and in the oral traditions Western academics too often dismissed. Science has finally developed tools sensitive enough to detect what indigenous knowledge systems never forgot: that the world's largest ocean was not a barrier but a highway connecting cultures through the extraordinary achievements of Polynesian voyagers. In the end, this story reveals not just what history books never told us about Polynesia, but what they never told us about ourselves. That human capabilities extend far beyond what our modern technological frameworks lead us to imagine, and that throughout history, different cultures have developed profound knowledge through paths we are only beginning to recognize and understand.